By studying the fossil record and comparing anatomical, developmental, and molecular information of organisms, we can see that life on Earth has evolved. Charles Darwin proposed natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. Evolution is a change in the heritable characteristics of a population from one generation to the next. Darwin used the phrase descent with modification to describe the unity of life, that all organisms are descended from ancestral organisms. Proposed in the early 1800s, evolution was controversial because scientists could neither explain nor show a mechanism that resulted in evolution. That is until Charles Darwin introduced his hypothesis of natural selection. Charles Darwin was a naturalist in England who also raised pigeons as a hobby. He was amazed at the physical varieties breeders produced by selecting for desired traits. In 1835, Darwin was hired as a naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle, a mapping ship that sailed around the world, making various stops, including a stop at the Galapagos Islands located west of Ecuador. While surveying the islands, Darwin collected samples of plants and animals, including a variety of birds that he believed were of very different species. Upon his return to England, a colleague identified many of the birds as being members of a group of closely related species of finches. Darwin had collected 12 of 14 different species of finches that inhabit the Galapagos Islands. Based on the identification of these 12 species and observations from other destinations along the way, Darwin developed a hypothesis that the Galapagos finches may have all originated from a common ancestral group of finches with the unique conditions on each island selecting for adaptations in finch populations. According to his hypothesis, a flock of ancestral finches flew to the Galapagos Islands from nearby Ecuador thousands of years ago. The islands are isolated from the South American mainland by 600 miles of open ocean and have different environmental resources, including food. The original colonizing population for each island exhibited variation in beak size and shape, and the islands varied in their food supply. Some islands contained mainly small seeds, others mainly larger, harder seeds, and still others had large insect populations. Finches with larger beaks could crack the larger, harder seeds, but had trouble collecting the smaller, delicate seeds. Finches with smaller beaks could pick up smaller seeds, but had trouble cracking larger seeds. On islands where the dominant food supply was larger, harder seeds, Darwin observed that finches with larger beaks were more prevalent. On islands where smaller seeds dominated the food supply, finches with smaller beaks were more prevalent. Darwin hypothesized that the food supply influenced the characteristics of the bird populations. The birds that are able to gather seeds most effectively are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing their traits to the next generation. This reproductive success is referred to as fitness. Birds that can't feed on the food supply as effectively are less likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, the favorable beak shapes become more common in the population. Darwin connected his observations of finches on the Galapagos Islands with the pigeon breeders in England selecting and breeding birds for specific traits. However, in this case, the environmental conditions selected for specific traits. Traits or adaptations that increase an individual's chance to survive and reproduce are more often passed to the next generation. Their offspring would exhibit those similar traits. Over time, the population would change. He called this process natural selection. Although Darwin could not have known this, the size and shape of a finch's beak is determined by multiple genes inherited from the parents. Mutations in the genes lead to new alleles, which are versions of a gene. These different alleles influence the size and shape of the finch's beaks. These alleles can be passed from parent to offspring. Offspring that receive the small beak alleles tend to have smaller beaks. Those receiving the large beak alleles will tend to have larger beaks. Because the beak size and shape are influenced by multiple genes with multiple alleles, there can be a large amount of genetic variation in a population, which can lead to various phenotypes. Natural selection acts on phenotypic variation. In a small population, allele frequencies can change rapidly due to natural selection. As descendants of the ancestral finches migrated to adjacent islands, they carried their alleles for beak size and other characteristics. The environmental conditions, including the food sources on each island, influenced the reproductive success of the birds, such that over time the population changed. After many changes accumulated in a population, it gave rise to a separate species. In the case of the Galapagos finches, the process of speciation occurred many times, producing the 14 species of finches currently found on the Galapagos Islands. In a similar way, natural selection has helped shape the evolution of many different species all over the world. Darwin relied on the scientific tools at his disposal, the fossil record, and anatomical, developmental, and environmental observations to formulate his hypothesis. It is significant to note that molecular studies have yielded further support to the theory of evolution by natural selection.